Hi guys. My name is Irfan Falk. I'm a psychiatrist here at Sierra Tucson. I've been working here for the past 3 years, about that. Thank you, Lila, for arranging this. Today I'm going to be speaking about the relationship of the experience of anxiety, why we experience anxiety from the perspective of evolution. You know, why is anxiety preserved in society, this pervasive experience? Are there evolutionary reasons why this could be valuable or not? Let's get started. While this presentation is going on, I'm going to turn the webcam off so you guys can focus on the slides. All right, so turn that off. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Okay, so I'm going to start off with this quote by Henry Maudsley. He's a prominent English psychiatrist from the 1800s. Eccentricities of thought and conduct have a special philosophic interest, inasmuch from time to time they turn out to be valuable mental variations that initiate new and useful developments, rarely and exceptionally, no doubt, but still here and there, and now and then. It's a fairly wordy quote that probably doesn't mean a whole lot right now, but I think if you return to this quote after this presentation, I think it fits really nicely with the perspective that I intend to present. So, you know, the intent of this presentation is to look at anxiety disorders and their impact in terms of form and function from the lens of an evolutionary perspective. This perspective doesn't really provide a new type of therapy. So the question that usually follows is, you know, who cares about the relationship between evolution's impact on mental disorders? Through the last 100 years of research and published psychiatric interest, there's been this pull of finding what causes mental illness. And it's been rather elusive, this pursuit. You know, is it a chemical imbalance? Maybe it's genetics. No. It's the distorted way that someone is thinking. Wait, maybe the answer is how the behavior is reinforced. What if it's a crisis of faith? What if it's due to family dynamics? Maybe it's the push and pull of unconscious conflict. You know, there's always this desire to explain something in a simplistic and linear fashion. But it's clearly a challenge when trying to understand the genesis of mental illness. Obviously, there are a lot of contributing factors that are considered when there's someone suffering. And I strongly believe that, you know, a framework that considers an evolutionary perspective tends to take many of those multiple and various factors that are relevant to the biopsychosocial model that we often use to try to explicate, you know, psychiatric disorders. So, you know, we're going to start this presentation with reviewing how common anxiety disorders are in society. We'll then move to what is contained in a normal anxiety response in broader terms. You know, to understand how anxiety can be abnormal, you have to understand what is the normal response and how they are useful. And then we'll ask ourselves, you know, does the anxiety response actually increase survivability, reproduction? If so, does it, you know, decrease mortality? And to note, we won't be covering the evolutionary perspective of other psychiatric disorders like depression and bipolar disorder, OCD, psychosis, personality disorders. They weren't really the focus in the preparation of this presentation. By the end of the presentation, my hope is that there's some movement away from looking at psychiatric symptoms as diseases and instead recognizing that, you know, negative emotions can certainly be useful in certain situations, and then to encourage looking at psychiatric presentations as part of a functional system that can malfunction, often for a multitude of reasons rather than one specific cause. This perspective can shed light why treatment works, what medication does in terms of disrupting a malfunctioning anxiety system, and how behavior therapy can adjust the internal mechanisms that are evolved to adjust our anxiety responses in relation to the environment. Anxiety disorders, you know, they're the most common mental illness in the United States. They affect to 40 million adults. ages 18 or older, and 18.1% of the population every year. And they can affect nearly 30% of adults at some point in their lives. They developed from a complex set of risk factors, including genetics, brain chemistry, personality, and life events. And despite being so common, it can be a challenge to treat it, especially with conventional interventions. For generalized anxiety disorder, commonly known as GAD, for example, although antidepressants are more effective than placebo, the number needed to treat is somewhere between 5 and 6. And so what that means is that it takes nearly 6 patients that need to be treated with medication to produce a clinically significant and symptomatic resolution in one patient. So the pervasiveness of anxiety disorders and their somewhat resistance to treatment suggests that, a need for a deeper understanding for their sources. The prevalence for anxiety and mood disorders in the population is puzzling from an evolutionary perspective. So that leads to the question, why did natural selection leave us so vulnerable to such disorders? What is the function of this behavior, if there's any? And what advantage does it presumably give to the individual or their kin or the individual's broader social system? So everyone experiences anxiety. It's characterized by this kind of diffuse, unpleasant, kind of vague sense of apprehension. It can prompt a person to take the necessary steps to prevent the threat or to lessen its consequences. And it's obvious that anxiety is adaptive in protecting the individual from danger or dangers. It's this reaction to stress, and it can be beneficial in some situations, and it can alert us to dangers and help us prepare and pay attention. Anxiety disorders, it differs from normal feelings of nervousness or anxiousness and involve this excessive fear. And it's a deviation from what is considered a normal or expected response, emotional response to an environmental event. But it can also present physically, affectively, cognitively, and behaviorally. Anxiety can be connected to fear, which is this emotional response to an immediate threat, and is associated with this flight or freeze reaction, either staying in the fight or leaving to escape in danger. An interesting way to understand anxiety is to see how it is observed in other forms, in other species. Compared to humans, it's a reasonable claim that there are some animals that are subject to near constant predation, being the primary diet of the associated predator species. So what can we learn from their reactions? Some species avoid danger by being enclosed, others by being exposed, and often to the endpoint of improving survival. An example of enclosed avoidance is captured in the picture all the way to the right, in the middle, enclosed avoidance, and that's the naked mole rat, which is rarely seen above ground. Open space avoidance is the picture on the right, which is commonly seen in rabbits who are known to suckle their young only once a day, only visiting them briefly so that they don't lead predators back to the brood. Ferrets are even more dramatic. They won't suckle their young. They will only suckle their young only once every 48 hours. And again, by doing this, predators, they're not able to really track where the brood is. And then there's some group living species that delegate the role of the anxious individual, the anxious one in the group. So they delegate that to be on watch while the rest of the members can go on and forage. And so an example of this is seen in meerkats, where the group forages while one kind of anxiously looks for birds of prey and terrestrial predators. If the group's ability to collectively survive goes down by diminished, if they don't trust the sentry that's on guard, then you can actually measure decreased foraging behavior, which obviously goes on to impact fitness and sustenance and survivability. So we can see how this delegation of responsibility And this tendency to be anxiously on guard is actually quite important for survival, at least from the perspective of the group. And if we keep in mind that there's this conservation of behavior among species, in that there are congruent behavioral or instinctual responses to kind of similar experiences across species, like the threat of annihilation, the pursuit of food, the necessity to belong to a broader social group. It may be beneficial to point out to individuals presenting with anxiety that they're suffering not from madness, but rather a mechanism that enabled our ancestors to survive the dangers of the past. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are different perspectives from which mental illness can be viewed. And there's been this cohesive push over the last 20 to 30 years that pushes the evaluation of mental illness by looking at biological, psychological, social, and spiritual angles. When looking at such factors, if we try to find a mechanism through which something is caused or occurs, those are called proximate explanations. But if someone's trying to find or describe how those mechanisms came to be the way they are and what their adaptive function is, then we're looking at evolutionary explanations. And both explanations complement each other, and together they aim to provide a fuller picture of what's being looked at. So let me just get on my soapbox and talk about how awesome the brain is. The mind, it's a wonderful thing. It's one of the most complex and mysterious structures in the universe. The same thing that has the capacity to learn multiple languages and memorize millions of items to be recalled, at the spark of a synapse. It's this thing that gives us the capacity to love and connect to one another, to ponder its own existence even. But on the other side, it has its own vulnerabilities and frailties. The evolutionary model centers around asking how the force of natural selection left us with such an amazing device to experience our lives with, but also so vulnerable to mental disorders. Why is it the brain works so well, but it is so prone to frailty? Literature regarding the evolutionary reasons behind mental illness vulnerability, it's yielded a number of reasons and models from which, like, why this may occur. And I'll present a few models today, and how that relates to the experience of anxiety. Now, these three models, they vary in perspective and are probably more relevant to specific contexts than others, but nonetheless, I think they provide like another dimension to understand anxiety. So let's talk about the mismatch model. So, there are things that seem useless but turn out to have a function. And then there are things that are quite important and they have a really important purpose, but they probably could have been designed better. Like the eyeball, right? The eyeball is amazing. It's a wonderful organ, but it probably would be better if it didn't have a blind spot, or the birth canal. It would be. I think there'd be less complications if the birth canal was a smidge wider, right? And even chronic disease, right? So chronic disease, many of them that exist today, they're now the result of living in modern times. That's not to say it would have been easier or better to live back in ancestral times where one's death is often felt to be a lot closer. Life expectancy was shorter, and the risk of something small like a cut could run the risk of infection or death. In modern times, we have an environment that's catered to our desires, where there's this broader protection from environmental elements. There's time for leisure. Delicious food no longer, takes a huge amount of effort to get. There's better relief from pain and infection. And these are all wonderful things, but they all can be linked, to a lot of chronic diseases as well. Diabetes, heart disease, addiction, and the list goes on. So when looking at topics like drive and motivation and survival, at least in ancestral times, the prevailing focus was usually on the present or near future, where actions now could deliver immediate and clear outcomes. So what I would call it is the immediate return environment, quote unquote, the immediate return environment. And however, now a lot of the choices we make, especially when it comes to drive and motivation, they don't really benefit us immediately. Sure, let's save money now for retirement later. Let's work now for that paycheck later. Many of our present worries are less about the immediate danger and necessity, and more about what's going to happen in the future. And that leads to stress and anxiety, perhaps because our brains were more designed to address the needs of this immediate return environment rather than, quote unquote, the delayed return environment that really is kind of captured in modern times. The earliest remains of modern humans are over 200,000 years old, and they represent the first humans that have a brain that's quite similar to ours, especially the neocortex, which is that shiny new top layer that surrounds the deeper brain structures. And what the neocortex does, it's in charge of things like language and conscious thought, planning, sensory perception, just to name a few. So compared to 200,000 years ago, modern society began its shift maybe, 500 years ago? Shifting away from its immediate return profile towards its delayed return profile. And let's just take a moment to marvel at the rapid changes of communication, technology, medicine, societal organization over even just the past 100 years. So we have this brain that spent hundreds of thousands of years to prepare for an environment that only in the blink of this evolutionary eye has shifted away from, immediate effort, creating an immediate return, to one where we now have to value the institutions of patience and consideration and planning. And even if we look at things really concretely, anxious avoidance of snakes and spiders very clearly has saved lives. But the fact that there isn't this inbuilt anxiety about cars and electric sockets, indicates that evolution, hasn't had enough time to kind of catch up. In the immediate return environment, stress and anxiety help take care of the short-term acute problems. But in the delayed environment, the issues that bring stress and anxiety are the ones that often can't be solved immediately. So then that becomes chronic and at times debilitating. You could study for years and still not get the job that you wanted. You could make measured, consistent investment choices and still lose the shirt off your back. You could try to set up a clear path to success and happiness for your children, but still be sideswiped by some unexpected tribulation. And it's this constant uncertainty that becomes this huge source of stress. Just thinking about kind of what a lot of us are going through, a lot of our patients are going through. Another example I think is how the current modern times have created this, misadjustment to internal mechanisms of action. And it's captured in this 24/7 news and social media cycle. Bad news sells, we all know that. And the amount of bad news one is exposed to may be loosely proportional to this general sense of unease when we think about the world. In the past, you would get news of death or other disaster, and maybe that would indicate that there's a nearby predator or a raiding party or something. But now, since we have this access to bad news of billions of people, the world just feels a little bit less secure, less safe, more risky. Often with this idea that there is little one can do immediately to rectify this unease. It's probably why so many people, or so many, promote the benefits of a technology diet, social media diet. Something that I find that a lot of my anxious patients really, really benefit from. So something to think about. Next, we'll move on to the signal detection model. This model looks at anxiety as a function of an internal process that is presumably important, but may be, felt to malfunction in terms of distress and quality of life. But from an evolutionary sense, it's actually working the way it should, in that it directly applies to survivability and reproduction. So why is it that anxiety is felt so often? If we think of anxiety as this protective mechanism, it increases your sensitivity to signs of a potential threat. And so that prepares the individual to respond appropriately to dangerous circumstances should they present themselves. Anxiety exists because those that have the capacity for it can escape often unpalatable and dangerous situations and hopefully avoid them in the future. But even if the danger is rare, it's valuable and beneficial to experience that sensitivity to signs of danger, that anxiety, especially if the costs of being unnecessarily anxious are comparatively less problematic, less costly than should the danger actually occur. So, let's look at the equation on the screen. Now, before I go on, all an equation tells us is how one side of the equal sign can be associated with things on the other side of the equal sign. So we'll try not to get bogged down in like the details, and I certainly won't ask you to do any calculations or anything like that. We're just looking at relationships. So what this equation is saying is that expressing anxiety varies with the probability of threats occurring and the individual's vulnerability to them should those occur, right? So this Greek symbol on the left, that represents the threshold in which anxiety is triggered. And if we're looking at the factors that are involved in that triggering of that threshold, the threshold trigger, then you have to look at these two factors on the right side. So this PNT over PT, that tells us whether a threat is imminent, and it looks at the cost of no threat compared to the cost of a threat. And the second part, the WFA over W miss, that tells us to consider the relationship between false alarms, which is when the anxiety is triggered when there really isn't a threat, and misses, where the anxiety is not triggered, but there actually was a threat, so it should have been, right? So that's a miss. So I think, let's just use an example. So, let's say there's someone walking about and they chance upon this oasis in the middle of this barren area. So that person, cautiously approaches it, slowly kneels down to get this beautifully refreshing sip of water, but uh-oh, the sound of a twig breaks behind them. So, the sound of a twig, you have to discern that from the background noise. Is this just a branch falling on the ground? Is this a small animal scurrying about? Perhaps it's a lion that's been slowly, following you for the last few miles and is about to get its meal. So if we look back at that equation, we have to look at the costs of what would happen if my anxiety did get triggered, but there was no threat. So what's the cost of that? So if I think there's a lion behind me, I'm going to go run away. So what's the cost of that? Maybe 100 calories, right? I'm running away. I'm booking it. But compare that with the cost of what would happen if there was a threat, right? If there was a lion there, that's me done. I'm done. And how many calories in our body? What, 100,000? So the cost of running away thinking there's a lion is 100-calorie loss. But the cost that if I missed it, ooh, that's my life. That's 100,000. That's 100,000 calories. So the ratio between the cost of the 100-calorie cost and the 100,000 is 1 to 1,000. And the rate of a false alarm would be then 999 out of 1,000, right? The best strategy is to run whenever the sound is loud enough to indicate a lion is around, with the probability greater of 1 out of 1,000. So what this suggests is, the experience of anxiety is going to be characterized by a highly sensitive system to ensure survival, given that the cost of the threat being viable compared to not being viable. So what's experienced is these frequent false alarms and this pervasive experience, otherwise labeled as anxiety. It's a useful response that often goes overboard. So the mechanism used to regulate one's protective response can often create the experience of anxiety, right? Again, the optimal system is one that protects oneself, and it will express many alarms that are unnecessary in a particular situation, but overall is normal in its responsiveness. You're not suffering from madness. I say again, it's just coming from a mechanism that kept our ancestors safe. This slide is it elaborates on this. It's for the visual learners. So let me just explain this really quick. So, the bottom axis is the strength of sensory information. So you have two distributions here. One distribution represents the sound that represents background noise, and the other distribution are the sounds that represent a threat, right? So notice that there's an overlap between the two. And that represents the point where sensory information that comes in, it could be background noise or represent an imminent threat. Now, ideally, threats would be immediately identifiable from background noise, but, alas, there's an overlap. It's important to consider that in this overlap space, there's going to be information that could be danger, but it's interpreted as background noise, and that would be a miss, right? And then there's going to be information that could be danger and trigger anxiety, but actually doesn't represent a risk of harm, and that would be a false alarm. And that threshold is the point in which anxiety is caused based off of the information coming in, right? So logically speaking, we can see that if the threshold that triggers anxiety is based off of incoming information, and if that's lower, you're going to have more of a probability of having a lot of false alarms, but also not going to have a lot of misses, right? That threshold to respond to the sensory information is going to be a lot lower, right? So you're not going to miss a lot. But if the threshold is higher, you're going to have a lot more of a probability to miss the danger, but also have a lot less false alarms, since it takes a high degree of sensory information to trigger it. So, this model demonstrates how some anxious presentations can seem overly excessive, hypersensitive at times, based off of where that threshold is. This model explains how extreme defensive responses can be aroused normally by cues that are only distantly similar to those associated with a life-threatening situation, like what we see in panic attacks or even trauma. And to expand on the idea, treatment would ideally shift this threshold point to something more functional and less disabling. You can do it by addressing, going back to the equation, the probability and vulnerability to whatever, the factors are that represent quote unquote danger, or changing the impression and the appraisal of these things. So shout out to CBT, like directly targets that. So we'll move on to the final model. And it's in the title. This model explains anxiety as an adaptation to prevent real or perceived social exclusion. So it's kind of focusing on the social exclusion part. And so it's based off this premise that there's this kind of basic need to belong to a specific group. So it's specific to a certain context that can have broader implications, I think. To understand this theory, we have to establish that modern evolutionary theory is based on the idea that evolution molds adaptations that promote reproductive success, not necessarily survival success, right? Sure, survival success can definitely mean reproductive success, but there are a lot of adaptive changes that we see in nature that promote reproductive success, but they also risk decreasing survival success. You can think about, the bright plumage of birds. Sure, it'll catch the eye of a prospective mate, but it risks predation. Or even, male risk-taking behavior, something that I think we've all seen. Yeah, sure, it can be dangerous, but successful with reproductive competition. So the question is, what kind of groups are so desirable? Like, what kind of groups are we trying to be part of from an evolutionary sense? And there are ones that offer cooperation with difficult tasks, sharing of resources, protection against danger. Other qualities is, these groups tend to have a high concentration of reproductively relevant resources, other individuals that share genes, so altruism can be directed, or even have non-kin relationships, these kind of reciprocal alliances, that are mutually beneficial in the exchange of resources. So Those outside of the group, it's a hard time. So, you draw a line under it. It's being in the group. It's much easier to find a mate than being outside of the group, and that's the ultimate evolutionary drive of this theory. So, if we consider anxiety as an adaptation in question, the condition of real or prospective social exclusion, it prevents the individual from committing acts that might lead to exclusion, leading, again, based off this human need to belong to a specific group. So anxiety is this adaptation that causes the organism to reassess behavior that threatens their inclusion to the group. So they may presumably be able to reassess and change its course of action. So in conclusion, evolutionary psychology, I think it can offer this explanation of why mechanisms are the way they are, why natural selection has not eliminated the variations that result in disease in some. It provides the multitude, it provides this this framework, to understand how behaviors are regulated to accomplish all these conflicting tasks that are required to live life. Instead of saying that there's one way to live and deviations of that are pathological, it considers just how complicated, the factors are that involve relationships and group dynamics, where resources are allocated, often with trade-offs and inefficiencies. And it provides more of a story in understanding something that is potentially impacted by a variety of factors. It reminds us that, negative emotions, they have functions, and it can provide insight into related or even peripheral mechanisms used to understand, survival, connection, drive, reproductive success. And I think this is a perspective that provides an enduring sense of empathy, when it comes to, our interaction with patients, of how complicated life is and how, despite those struggles, we can still find ways to adapt and change and move forward to live a life that that we all deserve. So, yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll take some questions now. So let's do this. So, are there social implications if the evolutionary perspective towards mental health is considered? So I guess, when you say social, I think of society. Sometimes collectively people are severely anxious because their environment predicates it, it justifies it. Especially in modern times, when you think of poverty across various demographic domains, lack of social support, housing difficulties, water access, these are all quote unquote lions of a different kind, of course, and it creates a different type of danger, but one that still creates a sense of peril, one that still impacts mortality nonetheless. And so tackling these issues, I think, can certainly shift on a population stage, those probabilities and vulnerabilities to threats, and would certainly across the population provide benefits to lower anxiety, especially if we think about that threshold point. So next one is, what is the utility of psychiatric medication with this perspective in mind? So psychiatric medication. So, if we remind ourselves that anxiety is a function of a regulatory system that can malfunction and often go overboard, medication works by downregulating the mechanism in the body that recognizes threats, and over time can actually adjust that in a way that is enduring. So medication will eventually potentially not be needed. If we look at behavioral or even psychotherapeutic interventions, they would also address that threshold trigger for anxiety. So, if we think about exposure therapy, you're putting the individual in situations to safely and gradually expose them to situations that create anxiety, but that anxiety essentially softens over time, and that reactivity of the system is then also decreases over time, which basically translates to lower anxiety. So I think if we look at what psychiatric medications do, or psychotherapeutic avenues. I think they really do. I think they explain a lot of things that we would see from the evolutionary perspective. So, well, that's all the time that I have. Thank you so much again for spending this morning with me, allowing me to present this material. And yeah, on to the next one. Thank you so much. Have a good one.